Hi everyone, my name is Katie and I have the distinct privilege of presenting to you today chapter 9, which is the communications chapter. I love that I got assigned this chapter because I'm a communications major, and so communications is always on my brain recently. So before I get started, I just wanted to say what a privilege it's been to learn from each of you this semester, to watch your presentations, to view your PowerPoints. Everyone's done such an amazing job, and I only look forward to the ones who haven't presented yet, learning the information that they have to present. I think it's really cool and unique that we get to kind of take our own spin and perspective and put it into a presentation and kind of teach ourselves. I think that's a lot of fun. So I'm going to dive right in. 8 to 10 minutes is not a whole lot of time. And so I'm going to try to kind of just cover the main ideas and key points of this communications chapter. So I think it's always important first to define exactly what communication is. I took a class recently where we talked about how difficult it can be to define communication because so many people see communication differently. And certain people, even communicate differently depending on where they come from or any disabilities that they might have. The communication realm can be very different. So I think our book does a good job of defining communication, stating that communication is the process of transmitting information from one person to another to create a shared understanding. I love that definition. I think that kind of encompasses communication completely and in a good light. So as you can see on my 6-part model slide, I created my own six-part model because I couldn't find one online that kind of matched our book. And so it's a little wonky, but I think it kind of gets the message and the idea across. So there are 6 parts to the communication model: encoding, message, channel, decoding, feedback, and noise. So my slide kind of goes into each of those individually, which I think is important, and you can kind of follow along just simplistically. I put just the book definition down for it. So encoding obviously occurs when the message sender converts a thought or idea or message composed of symbols or words. The message is the information that's being sent. The channel is the medium used to send the message. This can be done in so many ways. It can be done with your voice. It can be done through the internet. It can be done through videos, graphs, all kinds of things, which we'll kind of talk about in just a minute. Decoding is kind of the translation of the message, kind of taking the message and breaking it down into a translation. Feedback is just a check on how the message was sent. Did the message information send the way that the sender had intended? Did the receiver receive it the way the sender had intended? And then noise, as you can see on my 6-part model, it's everywhere because it can occur at any point during the process. Noise is anything that distorts or blocks the message and changes the way or the message from the way that the sender intended. Our book goes into talking about nonverbal communication, which I think we all have a pretty good idea of what that is. But nonverbal communication is just simply, it's not written, it's not spoken. It's simply like our body language, what we do with our body, not what we say with our mouth, but, do we smile? Do we shrug our shoulders? If we're sleepy, are we closing our eyes and nodding off? Different things like that. I think some of the most important nonverbal cues are things like a fire alarm, like I said, a smile when you're having one-on-one conversations with people. Even in today's generation, working at a school where I do, emojis are a big thing. The way that the emojis that you use, the way that you send them in your message says a lot to the receiver of the message. So our textbook breaks down nonverbal communication into 2 different realms. There's one-way communication, when the sender just sends out a message, but there's no feedback from the receiver. And then there's two-way communication, when the receiver does offer up feedback. Our book talks a lot about task interdependence. In order to really understand task interdependence, just think about it like this. When one person is dependent upon someone else or information in order to get their job done or to get their task completed, communication has to increase. If I in my job need my teachers to do certain things in order for me to complete my job, which happens a lot, our communication between each other really has to increase. We really have to focus on that communication line. I have to voice what it is that I need from them, what it is that I'm expecting, and they have to voice, they have to voice any concerns that they might have or anything like that. So within task interdependence, we have pool interdependence, which is basically when employees work independently, but that independent output creates a group output. There is sequential interdependence, which you can kind of think of like an assembly line. It just goes from one person to the next. And then there's reciprocal interdependence, which requires reciprocity all the time. It requires constant communication and mutual adjustment between the individuals communicating. There are several barriers to effective communication, which is actually what I did my research paper on. I focused on barriers in communication within the workplace. This kind of just is a generalized view of barriers within the workplace, or barriers in communication just in general, not within the workplace. So the first one that our book discusses is selective perception, which is basically we see and hear what we want to see and hear. So you can kind of think like when a wife says, my husband has selective hearing. It's kind of that same idea. We just see and hear what we want to see and hear. Misperception can be a barrier in communication, which is basically when messages are not decoded by the receiver the way that the sender intended. So think of it like this. The body language might not match the spoken. You might smile with your mouth, but you might have really terrible news coming out, and that's misperception. Filtering is information is intentionally withheld, ignored, or distorted to influence the message. So basically manipulating information so that the receiver will perceive it the way that the sender intended. There is information overload, which is just like it sounds. There's too much information. The ability to filter information is very important with information overload. So if I come into work one morning and I have 100 emails, which happens sometimes, working at a school, lots of people have lots of information, especially with the recent tragedies in South Florida. We get lots of emails daily. So if I come in one morning and I have 100 emails, I can't possibly, take in that much information in just one morning before the school day starts. I have to filter that information. I have to focus on, priority first, sender, who sent the information. That kind of helps me put it into, categories so that I can take the information a little bit at a time. So filtering is very important with information overload. There's also organizational barriers and cultural barriers, which I discussed a lot about in my research paper. Organizational barriers can be things simply as one organization might encourage open communication, and there might be an organization that doesn't. They might not want that open line of communication between employee and supervisor or employee to employee. Cultural barriers are just like they sound, things that might get in the way of you being able to communicate because of the cultures that you come from. I've witnessed that a lot in my school experience. We have a lot of students who are from different cultures. They're from Russia, they're from Puerto Rico, they're from Mexico, they're from all kinds of different places, and the communication barrier can be very difficult because we don't perceive things the same way, we don't send messages the same way, and we don't interpret messages the same way. So it can be very difficult, and it does definitely get in the way. And then noise was the last one that our book really hammered on, which noise, like I said before, is anything that blocks or distorts the message from being interpreted the way that the sender meant for it to be interpreted. There are a lot of communication skills that our book talks about, pretty self-explanatory. There's listening skills, writing skills, presentation skills, meeting skills. Listening is a very active thing. It's important to know what active listening is, especially as a manager. It's important to listen to your employees, listen to what they have to say. It's very important for effective leadership. Effective business writing has to be appropriate for the audience, so writing skills are important to learn and to intake. Presentation skills are often needed for proposals, or at school we do a lot of presentations for getting out information quickly and effectively. And meeting skills, as you can imagine, are important. I would imagine in all organizations, being able to meet and not waste people's time, but give them the information that they need and keep it moving. So just to recap, successful managers usually have strong communication skills. There are several different forms of communication skills that are important. Effective Effective listening skills are especially important. Managers and employees have to use several types of different media. I talk about the internet, collaboration software, intranets, oral communication, media richness in my PowerPoint. Those are different media outlets that businesses, companies, employees, managers might use to get their messages across an organization. Organizational communication is incredibly important. Our book discusses that organizational communication can move in a variety of directions. It can be informal, it can be formal, it can be downward, upward, horizontal, diagonal, and social networks often help to establish communication patterns within an organization. So that kind of falls into the organizational communication aspect. So, like I said at the beginning of my presentation, 8 to 10 minutes was not a lot of time, but I look forward to reading your comments and maybe being able to continue this conversation a little more and being able to reply. But to end, I wanted to ask a pretty simple question, but one that I think is open-ended and one that we could kind of go back and forth on if anybody wants to comment. So my question is, if you were going to communicate to your boss to give them bad news, which communication media would you use? I think that's very interesting. I fortunately have never been in a position to give my boss bad news, but I'm very interested to learn what communication media would you use in order to give your boss bad news. I look forward to your responses. It's been such a pleasure. I'm sorry I ran out of time. There's so much more that we could talk about. Communication is such an open-ended topic, and there's so much we can learn, but I look forward to reading your responses and to replying back to you. I hope you guys have a really great rest of the semester and that we can continue to learn from the people who have the last few chapters. God bless.